My name is Fadilat Olasupo, and I'm here with Jose Burgos. On March 24th, 2025, we're in Ann Arbor, Michigan. To start, can you tell us about where you grew up and your early life experiences?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. So I grew up in Southwest Detroit, but prior to that, I was born in Puerto Rico. And so not too long after I was born, maybe a couple of years after that, my family wanted to move to the mainland United States. So we ended up going to Florida. And then from Florida, we were probably there for like a year. My grandparents, my mom, my siblings. And then we stayed there for about a year. We were in Orlando, Florida, and then we ended up moving to Brooklyn, New York. I think my mother or somebody had a friend out there in New York or something like that. So I went to New York. In New York, I went to kindergarten, and after that, again, just like the time we spent in Florida, which was about a year, we ended up spending about a year in New York. And then I had an aunt who lived which my mom's sister lived in Detroit, and so we finally migrated to Detroit. Me, my mom, my siblings, and my grandparents. And so that's where we ended up at. I was staying with my grandparents. At the time, my mother still had a boyfriend who lived in New York, so periodically she would go back and forth and travel to New York to visit him or whatnot. And so by that time, my grandparents had me and my siblings in school. And so when my mother eventually decided to move to Detroit, they decided because we were already in school and for the stability of us, that we ended up staying with my grandparents. And so my grandparents actually became legal guardians of me, my brother, and my sister. And so that's where I grew up at. I grew up there in Detroit. I was there in terms of like school, I was there from the 1st to the 7th grade. Throughout that time, my family, I always share that my family, I didn't come from a home that was like riddled with drugs or any of that type of stuff. But I was a regular kid. I was during my elementary years and early junior high school years, always was somebody that was very curious about things. I always tell a story about I used to collect spiders and do that, those type of things. But then something tragically happened at the age of 13. At the age of 13, due to some issues that my mom was having with my stepdad, for whatever reason, she decided to take her own life. Right? She ended up taking a bottle of pills, and within days, she had lost her life. And that was very devastating for me at the time, trying to make sense of, what would, put my mom in a state of mind that would do something to herself, and then, to take her away from us was something that I took very hard. And it seems like immediately after the loss of my mom, like it had a tremendous amount of effect on me and my siblings. And like literally that same summer is the same summer that I actually started to started engaging with the kids in the neighborhood that were like doing mischief, kids that were involved in gang activity, and eventually ended up becoming a part of a gang. I always mention that gangs offer a false sense of familyhood, right? And I think what I felt that I was missing at home is what the gangs, I think, were trying to provide for me, right? But again, it was just a false sense of family. And that was actually, getting involved in gangs was actually the thing that got me involved with drugs, both using and selling. Also introduced me to violence. So again, when coming from a home that didn't see too much violence, getting involved in gangs is what kind of like set me in that direction. When I look back now, I know that was the turning point for my life. Kids who end up getting caught up in the system sometimes, experience a lot of trauma. And at that time when we're going through it, we don't understand that that's what it is that we're going through. It wasn't until later on in years later that I was able to reflect back and just take an honest inventory of what it was that I had went through to send me in the direction that I went to. So, yeah, that's where I was at, Southwest Detroit.
Now, during this interview, we're going to spend most of our time focusing on the last few years of your life, particularly your advocacy and activism. But is there anything that you want to tell us about how you ended up entangled in the criminal legal system?
It was. I mean, I can touch briefly on exactly what happened. I happened to walk into a conversation that some men were having, again, a gentleman from that same gang. We had an opportunity where there was a drug deal that was set up, but we ended up finding that both the buyers and the sellers both had the same intentions, right? Like we went to rob the buyers, and the buyers were robbing the sellers, right? We had weapons. The young man who unfortunately ended up losing his life also had a weapon on him. And within seconds of us actually coming together, there were shots fired. One man ended up losing his life. The other ended up paralyzed from the neck down. Those two individuals, unfortunately, as well, were twins. They also came, like their parents. They were from Iraq, and their parents had brought them here for a better life. And so, in many ways, it was a tragedy all the way around, because here it is. We had two 19-year old. They were 19 years old. I was 16, and then the other kids with me. But like for me, in my particular story, like my parents came to this country, looking for a better job, the very same way that their parents, brought them to this country for a better life. And for whatever reason, however it was, we ended up in this situation that just turned out to be tragic. I was 16 at the time. Prior to that, I had, maybe several run-ins with the law in terms of like curfew violations or something like that, but I had never been arrested or charged with any serious criminal activity. So this was actually like my first time ever being charged with a felony. So I was 16 years old. I was tried as an adult. One co-defendant who was 17 years old, she ended up with 25 to 50-year sentence. Two of my other co-defendants, one was 15, the other one was 16 as well. They were exonerated of the crime, so me and the female individual were the only ones that were actually convicted and sentenced. And so I was giving a life without parole sentence, as well as 15 to 30 years for armed robbery and 15 to 30 years to run concurrently with the life without parole that I was given. So I was 16 when I was actually charged, but by the time the whole process went through, the trial and everything, by the time I got sentenced, I had already turned 17, while I was in the Wayne County Youth Home. And so I was sentenced and then sent over to the Michigan Department of Corrections. The Michigan Reformatory is like the first prison that I went to.
Now, how did it feel at the time to be sentenced to life without parole?
It was devastating. It was devastating. It was devastating in the sense that, of course, I was giving a life sentence, but I don't think that at that time, like I really grasped what that was, right? Of course, we understand, what that, life without parole, as a sentence, as we know what that is. But to actually understand like the ramification of what it really, really meant, like it really, really meant that, I was going to die in prison, that I was not going to be able to, graduate from high school. I wasn't going to be able to, I was going to miss out on everything about life. I mean, my life had literally just started. So it was hard. It was very hard, walking into prison, seeing, a lot of young men that I was in a youth home with, right, seeing them come either behind me or those that were already there, also receiving those type of sentences. I didn't understand at that time. They weren't really having no conversations about anything that had anything to do with juvenile lifers. But something within my gut, like something was telling me like something is wrong with this sentence. I can't understand it now, but there's something is wrong about this. So it was very devastating, not even for myself, but for my family as well.
Now, did your defense attorney request any court action related to age and maturity during that process?
No. I remember at that time, judges still had an opportunity to sentence us as juveniles. So that would have meant that had I been sentenced as a juvenile, I would have went to a facility up to the age of 21. And so he argued, just based on my conduct when I was in the youth home, based on the fact that I didn't have no prior, no history with the system, that I could have been treated in the juvenile justice system, and that it would have been enough time to make those corrections, and that I would not have been, a problem for public safety or something like that. You know what I'm saying? So he did make that argument that I should be sentenced as a juvenile. But the judge at the time, one of the things that she mentioned was that, you know, the limitations to the statute was, she felt that they were unfair to both parties, because on one side, you know, she had, you know, if she sentenced me as an adult, it was life without parole. As juvenile, it would only been meant like 5 years. And so she, even though she knew that the harsher penalty was maybe too much, she just didn't feel comfortable, like, you know, sending me to the juvenile system for only 5 years. She didn't feel that that was enough. And so she went on ahead and sentenced me to the life without parole.
Could you talk a little bit more about what your relationship with your defense attorney was like?
Well, I had two attorneys throughout that whole process. My first one was a friend of a family friend or something like that. As soon as I was arrested, my grandparents found out that I had caught that case, and so they scrambled and like literally scraped up a few dollars, and a friend of a friend who was an attorney started representing me. But I noticed that throughout the process, there were several times that during my court hearings he didn't show up. I think he only maybe came to visit me one time and really didn't understand or explain what was going on. And so at one point during a pre-trial hearing, when my attorney again did not show up, the judge had mentioned that, hey, I don't think this guy's taking this, you know, serious enough, and so therefore I'm going to appoint you an attorney. And so I was like, all right, you know, me not really understanding what was going on, the legalities and all that stuff. I was like, yeah, whatever. If you feel this, you know, this is what's best for me, you know, that's what we'll do. And so I was appointed an attorney that was from Southwest Detroit. He was a Mexican American attorney who also spoke Spanish, so he was able to like communicate with my grandma about what was going on. But even when he came on the case, I remember he came on my case in November of 1991. I started trial around January or February it was. And I remember starting trial, and I mean the day of my trial, him telling me that there was going to be a victim who was going to come in and was going to testify. Well, at that time, you know, 6 months into this, the whole time I thought that both victims had been deceased. I didn't even know that one person was alive 6 months into this. And so when he told me that, I was like, what are you talking about? He said, yeah, he said, there's a surviving victim that's going to be testifying against you. And I was like, oh, I didn't know this. You know, how do I not know this 6 months into, you know, this case? And so true enough, that person, you know, a little bit later on that day, that person came in and testified against me. So that, you know, I think that my attorney maybe just like did the bare minimum. I mean, the whole time that, you know, the whole process, the trial and all the different hearings, like I would just literally just sit there and just let him, you know, do what he was doing, but not really understanding what was going on. I just couldn't understand, like, you know, this whole procedure, especially, you know, this is an adult procedure. And so, you know, I believe that he could have done more, but at that time, I just didn't even know no better.
Now let's talk about your advocacy inside of prison. Continuing to think about the time that you were incarcerated, what kind of advocacy were you involved in inside?
I think the first time that I ever even heard or thought about advocating for myself actually came, I think it was like 1997, 1998. I met another juvenile lifer by the name of Paredes, who had shared with me the Convention on the Rights of a Child, which is the convention of the United Nations. It's a convention that just about every other country in this world has signed on to, except the United States, right? And in that convention, there was an article in it that said that no child under the age of 18 shall receive a life sentence. And so that was the first time I even heard of anything that had to do with anybody that was under the age of 18, any type of like, you know, body of government that was saying that that is not an appropriate sentence for children. And so, you know, when he made me aware of that, I think that was like the first time I really became a little bit more conscious of who I was as a juvenile lifer. And so that's when I started to, like, you know, periodically, you know, going into the law library more often than I was, just learning about my case, learning about my sentence. And so I think that was like the first time, and that's what really like sent me in that direction. At that time I was still, I think, maybe like 21 or 22, so I really didn't know much of how to do this, but that's what first alerted me to that. But it wasn't really into 2003 when I really became active. At that time, I had got myself caught up with some trouble and was sent to a maximum security prison. I was designated as a member of a gang, so therefore a lot of the there's a lot of restrictions that were placed on me based on that classification. And so I remember sitting in the cell one time, and I was in solitary confinement, and I just woke up one day, man, and I was like, I started having an honest conversation with myself, an honest conversation with God, and I was looking in the mirror, and I was like, man, like, this can't be it for me. There has to be more to life than just this. I didn't have no attorney at the time. All my appeals had been exhausted. It was like, I literally felt that it was just like, it was done. It was over with. And literally 2 weeks after that, I get a knock on my door, and it was a letter from the ACLU from here from Ann Arbor, Deborah LaBelle, Attorney Deborah LaBelle, and she had sent me a letter saying, hey, we're doing a study on juveniles who are given life without parole sentences. We believe that this is an unconstitutional sentence, and we're going to try to pursue some type of legislative fix for this. But to do so, we need to get as much information from you and others like you to make this possible. And so, getting that letter, man, was like a breath of fresh air, right? It was like that little light at the end of the tunnel just all of a sudden just got a little bit brighter for me, right? The moment I got out of segregation several months later, of course, I wrote back and told them that, yeah, I would participate. I had an old, prison typewriter, went to the law library, and I got every possible address that I can find, and just started writing letters. I mean, literally every week I was just sending out. I mean, I think I ended up sending out maybe several thousand letters, right? And I remember by that time things were starting to progress real fast. There was an organization out here that was like had a petition that they were getting signatures for and stuff like that. And so I ended up getting a copy of that petition. I made a bunch of copies, and I was sending them out to all these different addresses that I just went and dug up. And I remember getting one letter back of all the thousands of letters I sent back. I got one letter back from a lady from Detroit who was expressing to me. She was thanking me. She was like, "Hey, man, like I didn't even know that this was going on here in Michigan." I went and took it to work. I got a bunch of my friends to sign a petition, and I sent it in. And that kind of like really, really got me going. I'm like, okay, this is it. I'm saying? It felt good to know that I was, I felt like I was in a fight now, right? Because I was informing people of not only myself, but just the broader subject of life without parole for juveniles. And that did it. That like really, really, sent me in that direction. I became somebody. Once I got out of segregation, out of maximum security, was like 3 years later. Everywhere I went after that, I was always in the law library reading, doing research of not only what was going on here in Michigan, but what was going on in other states as well. And just seeing the momentum that was starting to pick up a little bit, I was like, man, we might have something here, And so that really was what sent me in that direction.
Continuing to think about the time that you were incarcerated, what kind of advocacy were you involved in inside of prison?
So I think, that took on many forms, right? I think one of them was, like, as I mentioned earlier, like learning the law and understanding what was going on out there as it pertains to juvenile lifers, not only in the state of Michigan but elsewhere. I think was very important because what I was doing, like I would go to the law library and read these cases, and then I would get copies of these cases and I would bring them outside, and then I would share them with the other juvenile lifers, right? And so that was very important because there were those that, there were some that may not understand the law probably as clearly as I was understanding it, so I was able to like break it down to them in lay terms, exactly what was going on. And so that was one way, right? Empowering those with that information, but also like all the programming that I was involved in. So when I was at the Saginaw Correctional Facility, I was able to get into a program and was actually part of those of us who we started the program there at Saginaw. It was a youth return program, and the youth return program at the Saginaw facility. It came from the fact that at the Ryan facility, they also had a similar program, and there was a community leader from Saginaw that was driving every month down to Detroit, and he was taking at-risk youth into the facility to that program where they were like mentoring them, right, and sharing their story. And so when somebody at the Saginaw facility found out about this, they were like, well, there's no need for you to drive them to Detroit when we have a facility here in Saginaw, and we have mentors here, and so you can just start bringing them here. And so we created the Youth Return program. There was about 6 or 7 of us in that program, maybe like 2 or 3 juvenile lifers, and the other ones were adult lifers. And in that program, they would bring kids in from Saginaw, Flint, Bay City area, Midland area, and the vast majority of these kids were already kids that were already involved in the criminal justice system. They were already on probation, and so they would bring them there once a month, and we would go out there and we would share our story with them, and at the same time we would get a chance to like sit down with them and actually have a conversation with them. That played a huge role in just in my continued effort to change and embrace a whole different mindset, man. Like, you know, it was awesome, man, to like, you know, to be in that position from within, from incarceration, to be able to look at in the face of a kid that looks just like you, who was going through exactly what you were going through, and to have those conversations. I remember sometimes like the probation officer would sit down with us, and we would share with the probation officer something that the child might have opened up to us about, and the probation officer would say like, hey, I've been working with this kid for like 2 years, and I didn't know this about him, you know what I'm saying? And so us, because of what we had went through, those kids were able to like open up to us more than they were with their own probation officers, where in turn they were able to take that information, and now they had a place to start to try to help these kids, man, from, you know, going in that direction. And so I did that for maybe a couple of years at the Saginaw facility. From there I was transferred to the Thumb, and the Thumb, staff members from there had came to the Saginaw facility to visit our program, and based on our program at Saginaw, they created what was called the GOES program at the Thumb. The GOES program, the acronym stands for Guiding Our Adolescents to Live Successfully. And in that program was very, very similar to the one at Ryan and then the one at Saginaw. The only difference with the one at the Thumb was that not only were we talking to kids that were already on probation, we also had a high school from Grand Blanc, Michigan, that they were periodically bringing us a group of kids. And the probation kids, you see them like once a month and you don't see them again. But the kids from the high school, they were actually bringing them like every month. It was the same kids, you know what I'm saying? So we were able to like give these kids like maybe some homework or some assignments or something like that. And then we were able to like follow up with them the next month. They would come and say, hey, how you been doing? The teacher would, hey, he's doing better. Or so that was very important to me. I was also involved in dog training. So I was training dogs for they were for people that were blind. They were leader dogs and stuff like that. And one of the reasons I got involved in the dog program, I remember when they first brought it to the facility, I immediately thought about my victim and the victim that was paralyzed from the neck down, and I knew that was something that I was never going to be able to be repaired. But if I could do something as simple as train a dog that was going to be given to somebody who was in that same situation, then I think that was just my way of, that was my own restorative justice way, you know what I'm saying, of giving back to that community that needs assistance. I also had a chance to become a part of a program, it was called POA, Prisoner Observation Aid. As a prisoner observation aid, people that were, other inmates that were suicidal, right? Prior to the POA program, if a person was suicidal and it was placed in a suicide room, there was an officer that would sit in front of that cell and would 24 hours a day would watch that prisoner. You know what I'm saying? And so somehow they got a program from the program came from the federal system. They started to recognize that it was number one, it was cheaper, but it was also a lot better to have an inmate watch over this inmate, because it was easier for him to communicate with the inmate what it was that he was going through mentally. And so when I found out about this program, you know, I thought about my mom, you know what I'm saying, about my mom and what she went through, taking, you know what I'm saying, and this was also a way for me to like get back to that, you know what I'm saying, like, okay, you know what, I experienced suicide because my mom took her life. Maybe when I'm here talking to these men, you know, I can probably share the story, you know, share that story and just encourage them to like, you know, seek the help that they need and make them understand like what that really is, you know. And every possible program that was there, I created a book club where I had half of the people in the book club was lifers and half were like younger men that had outdates. And so not only were we there doing our book club, but I paired up one lifer to one young man as a mentor to at least talk to them at least at a very minimum once a week, and just to guide them through whatever struggles they were facing. And all of this while at the same time I am communicating with, lawyers. I did several radio interviews from inside about juvenile life without parole. There was a couple articles that came out in the paper, interviews that I did about it. So it all started from in there. It all started from in there. It all started from my time with the national lifers and things of that nature. Like, constantly, every single day, that's all we did. We walked the yard and we spoke about the things that we want to do when we're out here, and how we could help ourselves, in doing advocacy work. And I just I discovered something in me that I didn't even know existed. You know what I'm saying? I was like, man, I love this, man. It feels good, man, to really, really, really be in a fight. When I sat in front of that typewriter and I typed out that 15-page document, it felt so good. It felt so empowering to be actively involved in my own pursuit of justice and my own pursuit of freedom, and all of that, came out here with me. The relationship that I had on the inside, of my friends who are still in there doing life without parole. All that had a big impact on me then, and it still continues to do so now.
Now, were you a part of any associations such as the Michigan Lifers Association?
Yes, I was part of the National Lifers. At any facility that I went to and they had it, I was part of the National Lifers. There was also another organization. It was a Hispanic organization within the facility. It was called HASTA, and the acronym HASTA, Hispanic Americans Striving Toward Advancement. And so I got involved with that organization. That was more like a cultural type of organization. I ended up becoming the president of that organization and stuff like that. And but those were the two main ones that I was involved in.
Now, how did your understanding of the legal system evolve while you were incarcerated? You mentioned the law library. Could you speak a bit more about that sort of evolution?
Yeah. I remember when I first went to prison and I visited the law library at the Michigan Reformatory. It was I would look at these papers and these books and law books, man, and it was just like a blank. I did not understand nothing about it. But I realized that the more I got into reading, I started to notice that the more I was reading, the more I was understanding, right? And so the more and more that I read about the law as it pertained to my case and just the whole juvenile lifer thing, it definitely became a bit more, understanding for me. Law can be very, very complicated. It changes on a daily basis. And so you have to really, really stay up to date what's going on. One case may say one thing this week, and next week there's another ruling comes out that totally changes the outcome of that case. And so you really, really have to stay in tune. But I think that really also sparked something in me. Just having a way better understanding of why it was that I was legally there, opposed to what I knew when I first came in. So that became very, very important part of that process, just understanding the law.
All right. So can you walk me through your experience with resentencing after the Miller v. Alabama decision?
Yes, after Alabama came out Miller v. Alabama came out, Michigan, this 2012. So Michigan was one of the states that the Attorney General at the time immediately came out and said, this is not going to be retroactive, right? We're going to apply this to new cases, but the old cases, this was not going to apply to. I remember that same day that decision came down, I was called to control center a little bit later. I was watching a ticker, or somebody was watching a ticker early in the morning, about 9, 10 o'clock. It came on the ticker of CNN that the courts had ruled that it was unconstitutional to mandate that sentence. And word spread on the compound very fast. By 12 or 1 o'clock noon, by noon, 1 o'clock, I was called to control center. And there was a media outlet that wanted to talk to me about this. MERS, I think it was MERS News, if I can remember correctly. It's like an online thing in Lansing, and so they wanted to know what was my reaction to this thing about the possibility of me coming home. And so I went up there and I had a good conversation with the reporter, but I also had mentioned to him as much as excited as I am about the possibility, this is not one of those situations where all of a sudden we're going to have this big party, we're going to do backer flips and everybody's happy. And I said that because I knew that even though I was happy and, my family, when they found out they were going to be happy, there were still some victims tied to this. You know what I'm saying? There was still a mother who was still mourning the death of her son. There was still a mother that was taking care of her son who had now been paralyzed from the neck down. And so out of respect for them, I was like, I don't want, this is not one of those type of things. We don't, I don't know. It was just something that, I wanted to make sure that I didn't, go overboard with any show of excitement about it, because I want to be very, very respectful to my victims. But that's, so once that happened, when we found out that the Attorney General was saying that, this was not going to be retroactive, that sent us in a whole, for the next, I think like 6 years, it was like an emotional roller coaster, right? Because now they were going back and forth, in the federal courts and the state courts, trying to say that this was retroactive. And 1 minute we would win a case, and then the following case we would lose. And then in 2016, the Montgomery decision came down from the Supreme Court that said that the Miller would be applied retroactive. At that time here in Michigan, prior to the Montgomery ruling, once Miller was decided, there was some legislation that was passed, and in the legislation, it had mentioned that if this becomes retroactive, then this is how it's going to apply to the old cases. And how it was going to be applied to the old cases is that every prosecutor in every county in the state of Michigan would go through the list of those that were going to be affected by this, and then they would have to turn over that list to the chief justice, the chief judge in that county, with like a list of those that they were not going to seek life without parole on, and a list of those that they were going to seek life without parole on. The guys who they did not seek life without parole on would go first, and then those that they seeked it on will go second. And so I remember not too long after, I think it was like 90 days or 60 days after Montgomery was decided, is when people at that facility, at the time I was at the Thumb Correctional Facility, they started receiving letters from their individual attorneys saying, hey, we just got word from the prosecutor that you're not going to get life without parole, or they are going to seek it. And so in my case, I ended up getting a letter from my attorney saying that the prosecutor had decided that they wanted to seek life without parole on me again. And that decision was devastating again. I'm saying? Here, we've been waiting all these years. At that time, I had been years misconduct free. I was involved in a lot of programming. And so there was no way in the world that I felt they were going to be able to prove that I was, any longer a threat to society, that I deserve a term of years. And so it was, the first couple of days of processing that was a bit difficult, man. But I was like, you know what? It's a process, right? So I'm going to just wait it out. And so a year went by, and I was seeing juvenile lifers that were going back and forth and getting resentenced. They were seeing the parole board. They were getting released. And about a year later, it's when I went back to my attorney. I said, I think this is the time. A lot of guys have already gone forward. Maybe this is the time that we can reapproach the prosecutor again, explaining why it was that I deserve a term of years. And so, what I told him, I said, well, you know what? Let me type something up, right? So I jumped on my typewriter. I remember I typed out about a 15-page document, and in this document, I literally broke down everything about my life, the good, the bad, prior to incarceration, during incarceration, every possible ticket that I had caught while incarcerated. I explained exactly the details of every misconduct, and then the third part of that document was explaining how, based on the decision, how this applied to me in particular, or personally. And so I submitted to my attorney. I told my attorney, I said, hey, just give it to your secretary, have her do any grammar type stuff, but don't have her change anything. I want exactly what I typed up. This is what I want you to take to the prosecutor. And so, sure enough, I sent it to him. He had a secretary, fix any grammar. They submitted it to the prosecutor, and within 2 or 3 weeks, he got a response from the prosecutor saying, you know what, after reading this, I do believe that your client should receive a term of years, but we got to get this, approved by Kim Worthy, the head prosecutor. So give me a couple months. This was in November of 2017. In February of 2018, he received a letter from the prosecutor saying, hey, we got the main prosecutor to sign off on this. And so they came with an offer of 30 to 60 years. With 30 to 60 years, but I would also have to forego appealing after I got sentenced. Like, I couldn't appeal that sentence no more. And so I immediately signed, like, yes, I'm in agreement with that. Now, during that time, when I signed the agreement, it was also a time that the Attorney General was fighting as to whether juvenile lifers, if good time was going to be applied to us, or good time and disciplinary encouragement. Because at the time that we were arrested and charged and convicted for our crimes, disciplinary credit / good time was still available. But because we were doing life sentences, we wouldn't get this, and so the Attorney General in the state was fighting us. But again, not too long after I signed that agreement, maybe like 2 or 3 months after, maybe like 2 months afterwards, the federal courts had ruled in favor of juvenile lifers receiving good time, meaning that when I was going to get sentenced to the 30 to 60, because good time was going to be applied to me, I didn't know then, but like once I was sentenced and they calculated my time, I had 5 years of good time, and so out of the 30, it was reduced by 5, which meant that I was already past my first out date by like 2 or 3 years. And so I went back and got resentenced May 3rd, and I remember I was taken down to the Wayne County Jail, and several days later is when they had the hearing. All my family was there. The victim, the surviving victim, actually got a chance to speak. And unbeknownst to me, to my surprise, during the time that the victim was speaking on the phone, he had told the judge, "Look, I'm not here to tell you to give him, 20 or 30 more years. If he can go home and prevent somebody else and some other kids from going down, the same path and prevent, from happening what we went through, that I'm okay with that, right?" And so the judge went on ahead and just, spoke on the record about, my record and that he felt that I had made some changes in my life. And so that's when I was given the 30 to 60. Again, this was in May of 2018. I saw the parole board maybe about 2 months after that, and I was granted a parole and released October 23rd of that same year, which was 2018.
Now, I want to go backwards just a little bit and think about how you prepared for resentencing, both mentally and with your attorney, with any supports you had. What was that like for you?
I think, unknowing to me, when I first came to prison, I think in a way I was preparing for this before it happened, right? And the reason why I say that is because I always remember there was the one piece of advice, man, that I got from one of the old heads when I first came to prison was, don't let the world forget you, right? And when I asked him what that meant at that time, he was like, you know what? He said, sometimes when we write somebody and we don't hear back from them, he said, it's only going to cost you 25 cents. It's 25-cent stamp to a couple months later write that person back and say, hey, don't forget about me, right? Making sure that I maintained communication with however many people I could, right? And he explained to me, like, it's very important, he said, because a lot of times what happens is that people come to prison with these life sentences, and all of a sudden they think that it's easier for them to do that life sentences by separating themselves and completely cutting themselves off from society, but they do a disservice to themselves, you know what I'm saying? Because all of a sudden now, everything about prison now becomes your life, and it becomes very important, you know what I'm saying? And if you don't exist out there, whether it's just in thought, even though you can't physically be there, but if you don't exist in a free world in thought with somebody, then you don't exist, right? And so that's what he meant by not letting the world forget me. And so throughout my years of incarceration, I always found ways of maintaining communication. And so coming home wasn't, of course there was a lot of things that had changed, and there was a lot of things that I was going to now need to learn. But like, for example, like the internet, even though during incarceration, I didn't have access to the internet, by talking to people on the phone all the time, I knew what the internet was. On the inside, I didn't have access to cell phones, but by talking to people, I knew, what they were and what they did. And so when I got out, I wasn't so lost, right? I wasn't so lost because again, I always maintained that communication.
Now, let's talk about your experiences post-release. What was your re-entry experience like?
I was blessed to still have my grandmother living when I came home. I had some very great friends that had came back into my life, childhood friends that had came back to my life, like, years prior to me being released. So I was always constantly, talking to them about, like, yeah, man, there's this juvenile lifer thing going on, man. There's a chance that I'm going to come home. And then there were people that, I think believed in it, but at the same time, because there was so much going on in the courts, and 1 minute I was like, yeah, this is going to happen now, we got to wait a little bit longer. And so they kind of like, there were some people who, they wasn't very so much convinced, but they weren't going to tell me that, right? They knew that this is what I lived on, and this is what I believe. And so they were still going to be supportive of me regardless of whether this happened or not, right? And so, but coming home, like having my grandmother there was just amazing, right? Just, getting home and, the same person that was there when I got to life without parole was there when it was undone, and to come home and have her there was very important. And then just having, the friends that were with me, those who came and picked me up. My sister, when I left to prison, she was 14 years old. Now at the time, I think she was like 41, and so she was there to pick me up. And so it was amazing. It was amazing. It was also a bit scary, right? Because you didn't know what to expect. I didn't know how the world was going, to receive me. There were people who might have not followed my transformation, so I wondered, would people still see me and view me as the person who committed that crime, opposed to the 43-year-old man that I was at the time of my release. But to my surprise, I was embraced, a lot. I was helped a lot. The first few months, like every time I ran into a friend or somebody who I did time with, they were reaching into their pockets and giving me money, just helping me out, get on my feet. And so I think the first couple months, in that sense, went smooth. But mentally, it was a lot to process. I remember I always share the fact that, about 2 or 3 weeks after being released, I found myself one day in the middle of the kitchen at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and just crying. And I couldn't figure out why I was crying, right? I was like, man, what am I crying for? Like, I'm supposed to be happy and I'm home. But I quickly realized that, during incarceration, we suppress so much emotion, right? When you lose somebody, a loved one in there, you don't have time to mourn that person. You get a phone call, you find out that person is gone, and the next day, that life without parole is still there, and therefore you got to move on, right? You suppress the emotion, and it was almost like magical. It was almost like your mind and your body knew that it was no longer confined, and it was almost like it was allowing itself, man, just to purge all that emotion. You know what I'm saying? So I embraced it, right? I embraced it. Talking to other juvenile lifers who had also experienced that very same thing was also it also helped me a lot because I knew I wasn't going crazy. I knew I wasn't tripping. It was just something that normally some of us went through. And so when I went through that phase, like literally I would be in the middle of, I was in a car driving on the freeway or something, and all of a sudden just a gang of emotions just come down on me. I just started crying. So it took a minute to get through that. And then, the reality of having to get a job and having to pay bills and all this stuff, now all that started to settle in. But with my situation, when I got out, because I was born in Puerto Rico, I ran into a hurdle that the MDOC, prior to me getting out, they were not able to get my birth certificate. And so when I went to the Secretary of State to try to get an ID, like no matter how many documents I had a parolee ID, I had letters from my parole agent, I had my social security card, and every possible document aside from the birth certificate that you can think of to prove my identity, it still wasn't enough, right? And I think going through that process, I think was like one of the first glimpses of like advocacy, right? Because I was thinking to myself, like, this has to change, right? I can't possibly go on the rest of my life without no ID. Somehow this has to change, because here was in 2018, the state of Michigan had poured millions of dollars into reentry. Why is it that an ID card, a vital record, why is it that we're struggling with this when we're coming home? You know what I'm saying? This is like the essential part of reentry, and here it is, we're coming home without these documents. And so I ended up having to get a job under the table because I couldn't open up no bank account and any of that. And it was at that job one day when it's like a light bulb went out and said, you know what? Puerto Rico is not a state, so we don't have no representatives, but we have delegates, right? And those delegates are based in Washington, D.C., so let me see if I can find a phone number. And so I found that phone number, I called the office, they connected me with somebody, and within 2 months of making that phone call, I had my birth certificate. And so I got my birth certificate, went and got my ID, and during that time, there were talks that there was a state rep that was in the process of introducing some legislation here that would ensure that those coming home from prison had vital records. And so I ended up, communicating with him. And so that started my advocacy for vital records. But even before that, I was already engaged in with the campaign for the fair sentencing of youth, because periodically they would come into the state advocating for legislation in Michigan, and so because I was intentional when I first came out to communicate with them first, they would communicate with me, and I would be the one that would gather like all the other juvenile lifers to go up to like Lansing and advocate for legislation, and so that's what really got the ball going. And after I got my birth certificate is also when they happened to have a position at the State Appellate Defender's Office. It was a reentry specialist position, and so somebody suggested that I submit a resume, and to my surprise, I ended up getting the job. You know what I'm saying? And so now I was helping those that were coming behind me. Now I was helping them, making sure that they had reentry plans when they were going to get resentenced, making sure that they had vital records when they were coming home. So that really opened the doors for me for advocacy, because that just it opened up a ton of doors to start pursuing that.
Now, when you first came out, what supports and services did you have? Because you talked about going through this process of trying to figure things out. But were there any supports, any services that you had access to?
I mean, there were services that were provided by through my parole agent, like job fairs, Michigan Works, and stuff like that. But when I would go to these things, I don't know why, but for some reason, what they were offering just wasn't, grasping my attention. I mean, they were offering like all these different type of trades and stuff like that, and I would have done it. Don't get me wrong. I would have at that time. I was thinking like, whatever job I can get, I'm going to take it. But for some reason, that wasn't calling me. I remember even there was while I was going through this ID thing. I remember going through one of those job fairs, and there was a booth set up by what was called at the time, I think they're still in existence, Detroit ID. And Detroit ID was something that Mayor Duggan had came up with to provide IDs for Detroit citizens who, for whatever other reasons, weren't able to get like a state ID. And I remember going to the booth and I explained to them my situation. They said I need an ID, and they was like, well, where you live at? And so I actually lived in Ecorse, which is like downriver Detroit. And so, well, you have to live in Detroit to be able to get this ID. And to my surprise, the guy who's running the booth, he tells me, do you have any family members in Detroit? And I was like, yeah, I got a sister and brother and stuff. He said, why don't you just get a bill, put in your name, and you can bring us that bill, and now you have an ID, and and I was thinking to myself, I'm like, you're literally asking me to commit a crime here. This is fraud that you're asking me to, what I'm saying? Like, why should I have to go through that, right? Because if I walk out of this building right now and violate parole, you're going to know exactly who I am, right? You're going to, violate my parole. You're going to send me back to prison. Like, why should I have to go through this, right? And so, but those services were available. By the time I made it to the reentry specialist position, I was familiar with those services. So now, when I was helping guys out, I would always revert back to like, okay, well, I remember, this service or that service, and so I was utilizing those services for those guys. But there were some services available, but I think the one that was more instrumental to me was Project Reentry at the State Appellate Defender's Office.
So what are some activities or hobbies you've enjoyed since your release?
Man, every single minute of my life is just dedicated to my work. And I swear, I was just telling somebody the other day, like, I need to find me a hobby, right? Because I wake up at 6 o'clock, and by 6:30, I don't have to be at work at 9 o'clock, and by 6:30, I'm on my computer doing work, right? It's a real passion, the work that I do is a real passion of mine, man. And, I try my best to do self-care and go out and do things outside of work, but like this is my 24/7 work.
Okay. Today, can you tell me what you're most proud of?
That's a good question, because I've been home now a little bit over 6 years, and I've been everywhere around this country traveling, and but I guess if I can point one of the things that I'm proud of, and I had mentioned to you earlier, getting an opportunity to go back into prison, and being able to give those that are still behind a glimpse of hope, right? I just recently visited the Thump Correctional Facility. That was the facility that I did my last few years at. So being able to go back and just share with the gentlemen that were there, that there are obstacles when you come home from incarceration, especially those that serve, a large amount of time. But I believe that if you want it bad enough, like if you really, really want it bad enough, that you can do it. And I'm a prime example of that. I came home, I literally had nothing, and now I work for a large, a national nonprofit doing this work, and I was explaining to them the work that I do. So I think, because I remember, during my incarceration, I always never forget this. I would always hear about, and there weren't that many, but I would always hear about those who had gotten out and were giving back. Right? They were out here advocating for us. And I remember how good that made me feel. I remember how much hope that gave me. And I always told myself, and I never shared that with nobody while I was in there, but I always told myself, man, I said, man, if I ever get an opportunity, it'd be real cool, man, to give that hope back to somebody else, right? Pay it forward, And so if anything, I think the most thing that I'm most proud of is like, I've been and continue to be like the best example that I could be, coming from in there. You know what I'm saying? That's one of the things that I share with them guys in there. Like, every room that I walk in, I do so representing you guys, right? And I put my best foot forward to be an example to this world, to let them know, whether you're a juvenile lifer or not, that people who really have a desire to change in life and then really really want to come out here and make a difference, like they shouldn't be defined like their worst moment. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's one of the things I'm most proud of.
This is a perfect segue into the next section, which is on your advocacy and activism post-release. So can you describe your current advocacy work?
Yes. So in 2023, it was 2023, is when I joined who I work for now, which is the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. And I got a crazy story about how that happened, right? And so being that, again, I was engaging with them all the time, doing panel discussions about this issue, sharing my story. I was invited by CFSY to a dinner in New York at the Ford Foundation. And we went there, and they were just highlighting, the work that they were doing. And so they have brought some directly impacted members to just share a little bit about what we were doing. And I got a chance, it was literally 3 minutes. I got up and said, hey, I'm Jose, I'm from Michigan, this is what I'm doing, I'm a former juvenile lifer. And I was just like literally on the way, once the dinner was over, on my way out, downstairs, already outside of the building, I was approached by a young lady by the name of Julie Meritu, who is an artist in New York. It just so happened that Julie is Ethiopian born. She was raised in East Lansing, Michigan, and she asked me, hey, what you got going on in Michigan? And so I explained to her, I said, well, this is what we're going on. She said, well, how can I help? She said, I'm not a politician. She said, but I'm an artist. I said, well, I'll tell you what, when I go back home, I'll communicate with you and we'll figure out how we can do this. One, to make a long story short, Julie, we jumped on a meeting and she ended up donating. She did a painting, she donated it and sold that painting at her art gallery, which sold for several $100,000 that she donated to CFSY, specifically to hire somebody here in Michigan. Because even though I was already engaged I was working at SADO, but every now and then when they would come in, I would have to leave SADO and go with them and go up there. And they wanted to hire somebody that this could be a full-time job for them. And so after that meeting, I still I was already making suggestions of who this person could be. I wasn't even thinking about myself. I was like, you know what, we got this person, they're doing some awesome work. But the executive directors of CFSY, they came to me and said, hey, you went and got this, man. It's only right that we offer this to you. And so they made me an offer, and I was like, you know what? This is what I wanted to do. For the last 4 or 5 years, I had been telling my girlfriend, one day I'm going to work for CFSY, right? And even a year prior to that, I had an interview with them, and they had gave the job to somebody else. But I still had the mindset that one day I was going to work for them. And so that's how I got into the work that I was doing. So I ended up getting a position. They made me the Michigan campaign coordinator for Michigan. And so my job now is strictly on ending life without parole in the state of Michigan. And last year we came very, very close to doing that. Out of the 56 votes that we needed on the House side, we ended up getting like 53 votes. And it was leaving. I remember leaving the Capitol during lame duck in 2024 in December. Going home knowing that we didn't make it, man, was just like heartbreaking to me. I was literally in tears, right? Because how am I going to explain this to to my guys on the inside who are still waiting. And so that's what I've been doing. I've been fighting that here in Michigan, not only in Michigan, but I've also been helping CFSY with the work that they're doing nationally to get rid of this. The vital records bill that I mentioned earlier were also bills that passed. They passed the House, they passed the Senate. They're doing lame duck, but the governor ended up vetoing the bills because there were some issues with the language in the bills, and so now we're going to reintroduce those bills and see if we can get those passed. I also do work with there's a Human Rights Watch project that I'm involved in. It's called the National Life Without Parole Leadership Council, which is it's a committee of 14 formerly incarcerated lifers, juvenile and non-juvenile. And with that work, we're doing national advocacy around life without parole, not only for juveniles, but for everybody. We believe that everybody should at least have an opportunity to prove their cases to a parole board or judge for an opportunity. And so that is the work that I'm actually involved in now.
Now, what impact, you talked a little bit about some of the impact of the work your advocacy has done. Can you speak more about that, maybe the impact on individuals, communities, and policies?
I think for individuals, I mean, for those that are inside still currently serving their sentence. Now, Michigan is still a state that currently sentences children to life without parole. I think for them, I think it gives them and their families a lot of hope, knowing that somebody who actually went through that process is now, actively involved in the front lines, fighting this. So I think that's like the main important thing. But I think also, I go around and sometimes I speak to students in colleges. I go and any opportunity that I get to talk about this, I think is very important. So I want to believe that it has had an impact. I think those of us who have gotten out and we're being good examples of what we could be outside of prison is starting to really change the conversations of surrounding juvenile life without parole. It's starting to change minds. When we were one example, when we were up there during lame duck session and we were trying to get this passed, we ended up finding out that there was a state rep whose grandfather was a victim of a juvenile lifer. Right, his grandfather was actually murdered by a juvenile lifer, and he was having a hard time deciding, how does he go home and tell his mom that he voted in favor of a bill that would have released the person who did this to grandfather. And I got a chance. I didn't get a chance to talk to him directly, but I got a chance to speak to his legislative aide, shared my story. And later on that day, as I was in the gallery of the house there up there in legislation, I seen that state rep walk over to our bill sponsor and had a conversation. And when I noticed that, I told my colleague who was with me, I said, let's go down here and find out what that conversation was about. And before we could make it down to the floor to speak to our sponsor, we had got a text message saying, hey, that representative just walked up and changed his vote from a no to a yes. You know what I'm saying? And so it is having an impact, right? It's having an impact not only in situations like that, but all over, not only in Michigan, but we've had over 1,000 former juvenile lifers released in this country that were doing work in the community. We're talking to kids in school, entrepreneurship. We're getting involved in nonprofits. You know what I'm saying? So we're definitely, not only myself, but we're definitely seeing a shift. And I think people are starting to believe you know what, I think we got it wrong here. You know what I'm saying? We can be tough on crime. We can hold children accountable for the things they do. But what we don't need to do is we don't need to give them life without parole. You know what I'm saying? At least give them an opportunity, and that's what I'm always preaching. Hey, I'm not saying that we should get a slap on the wrist for what we did. Some of the crimes that we committed are some horrible crimes, and we should be held accountable. But I don't think that children in this country, we hold children up as that's our prized possession. This is who we look forward to, taking over our leaders of the future, and hope should never be taken away from a child. And so that is the message that we're continuing to push out there, and I think that's the impact that we're having.
Now, what challenges or barriers have you faced in your current advocacy work?
Challenges? I don't know if I can say of course, when I first got into advocacy work, there was the challenge of not knowing what this work looked like, right? Not really knowing like the rules of engaging with legislators and stuff like that. You know what I'm saying? So if there was any challenges, there were challenges that had to do with that. You know what I'm saying? Learning how to engage, learning how to articulate your thoughts, because it's a whole different. I think it's like a whole different type of language when you're talking to legislators, right? And so just being able to learning how to communicate with legislators, learning how to articulate my thoughts, my story. I think probably were some of the challenges. I mean, there's always those personal, things you sometimes wonder, am I getting my message across properly? Are they accepting my message are they accepting the message that's coming from somebody who's formerly incarcerated? So you always have those things in the back of your mind, but I think if you put your best foot forward, I mean, that's the best that you can do,
What are your long-term advocacy or activism goals?
I want to get rid of the sentence, not only in the state of Michigan, but throughout this country, right? And once I get that done, if I can go, if there's anywhere else in this world that's still doing it, I just got a passport, and that's where I'm going to go. You know what I'm saying? So I'm going to really, continue to push this. So far, CFSY has been very instrumental in getting that sentence abolished in like 28 states. And so we're hoping that, Michigan becomes that 29th state. There's a lot of things that have been happening, in politics. And so, I think there's a lot of hurdles that, we'll have to get over now. But I'm very optimistic. I mean, I was literally in prison doing life without parole, and I'm here, you know what I'm saying? So my optimism is like is to the roof, right? I always believe that there's a way, I always believe there's a way, even though there are people who are totally against this, I still believe that there's a way to get this done, and I won't stop until it gets done.
With regard to getting this done, what do you believe has been the best way to affect change through advocacy and activism?
I think the best thing that has happened is that those of us who have experienced it are now on the front lines we're at that table having that conversation. I don't think it would have ever gotten done without having somebody who has been impacted literally sharing, what they went through. And I think that's like the most thing that's the most important, right? Is for us to share, what it's like to be a child and be told that you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison, to be placed in a system that was created for adults and not children in mind. That is a horrible, horrible, horrible experience, right? And so, but I think like the thing that has been most effective now is that we are now at a table having those discussions.
Now, reflecting on your journey, what changes do you believe are still needed in the criminal legal system?
There's so many. Again, number one, I personally don't believe that children. We have to do something better in how we prosecute children, right? The rhetoric that we used or that politicians used, back when they first created these laws, right? It was rhetoric that was based on false information, right? There was, criminologists at that time who came out and was predicting all this stuff about super predators and stuff like that. That those very same criminologists years later, came out and said that they had it wrong, right? And so, like, number one, they should be held accountable for that. You know what I'm saying? Because as a result of the rhetoric and the stuff that they were putting out, right? As they were putting this stuff as science, like this is law, this is what's going on. This, we had this new species. It was almost like it's like a new human being. It was like we had this new species of kids who are going to come out, and it's going, it's going to be a wave of juvenile crime. That didn't pan out, right? And one example of that here in Michigan, because of that rhetoric, like here in Michigan, they created the punk prison, right? It was supposed to be a prison. They built it specifically for this so-called wave of children who are going to be committing on this crime that never panned out, and they ended up having to close that facility. So that's one example. And so how we prosecute kids, man, I think that we have done a huge disservice. I think we can, we spent so much money into like prosecuting kids as adults that if we could have took that money and diverted it somewhere else to prevent kids from getting caught up in the first place, I think that would have done us a lot good. In schools, the school to prison pipeline, that is real. That is real. The vast majority of juvenile lifers When you look back, you can see the data shows that these kids came from failing school districts, right? And so we need to pump money into these school districts that are still today, they're still failing, and kids from these same very schools are still being sent to prison. And so I think we need to go back to the drawing board and see how we process kids who get caught up in the system.
What advice would you give to individuals currently serving juvenile life sentences and or awaiting resentencing?
Don't give up. Hold out to hope, right? It's so easy. It's so easy to get caught up in prison politics. It's so easy, especially those, because, like I said, even though I was fortunate enough to have family members, I literally know juvenile lifers that served 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and during the whole time of their incarceration might have only got one visit from a parent or from a family member, and so, somebody who is going through that, hopelessness can set in so quick, and when you allow that hopelessness to set in, it just does something. I remember, one of the things that kept me holding on to hope was that I would see adults who had already been in prison for decades. I had seen people who were already mentally institutionalized, and I literally was afraid of that. I was afraid of becoming that, and so my advice to them would be not to lose hope. Always maintain communication with your families and your loved ones. Make sure that you understand the law as it applies to your case, and no matter what the outcome is, I also believe that even while you're there, there's so much that we can do even from in there. You know what I'm saying? Because 10, 20, 30 years into that life sentence, you're going to have that 16 and 17-year-old that's going to come behind you. And if for whatever reason you're not able to walk out of prison one day, at a very minimum, I think we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to society to help that young man that's coming in and make better decisions so that when that person gets released, that person never goes back. You know what I'm saying? So I think just that, just hold on to hope, because you just never know. Whether it's 30, 40 years down the line, you never know what could happen legislatively. You never know what governor might be in place that can possibly commute that sentence. And so just hang on to hope.
What advice would you give someone who has just been released?
You gotta want it bad enough. You gotta want it bad enough. You can't forget those lonely nights that when you're in prison. You can't forget, your daily movement for however many years you did your time, how that was under the control of somebody else, right? As humans, we deserve it to ourselves to live the best life we can possibly live, right? And don't be hard on yourself either. You know what I'm saying? Forgive yourself. You know what I'm saying? A lot of us walk and we live this life even after incarceration. We live with this burden of the crimes that we committed. You know what I'm saying? You can forgive yourself. You can forgive yourself. You can reinvent yourself. And it's never too late. It's never too late to come out here and still make something out of your life and still live with some sort of purpose.
Is there anything else you would like to share about your journey or your experiences that we have not covered?
Man, there's so much to this journey, man. And for me personally, going through this process, I remember while I was going through it, I used to always try to make sense, right, of why I was going through it, right? And it's hard to make sense of it when you know the lost, right? It's hard to make sense of, going through something like that, and then I've come out and my life has taken a whole 360 of where it began from, right? And so now I look back at my life, right, and now it makes sense, right? It's hard to make sense because of the loss of life, but I'm a big believer, every single possible problem that every possible problem that humans have faced, right, no matter how hard, no matter how easy, it took somebody to have to go through that to fix it, right? And so I don't know why that landed on my shoulders, right, to fix that problem, but I know that in order to fix that, I had to go through that, You know, I had to go through that, and so I'm hoping that I am doing a good service to that, because I totally don't believe that it is not of my doing, right? I believe in a higher power, so there's definitely no doubt in my mind that that I was placed here for this reason, and that's why I believe so much in the fact that it's gonna happen, because it's not me. You know what I'm saying? I am a servant of this world. I was placed here for a reason, and I believe that me going through my experience is going to be the thing that changes it. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm gonna end the recording.
A position I got with Snapping Home, like another position I got is I was appointed to the Michigan Committee on Juvenile Justice by the governor. You know, and so that's an advisory to the governor on the board of directors of Safe and Just Michigan. I am a member of the Prison and Correction section for the state bar as a non-attorney member. Just so many doors have opened, you know, never in a million years. I mean, I knew I wanted to come and do something, but never in a million years that I think it would take this route. And I'm just loving it. I'm just loving it, embracing it, and just going with it, you know. But it's pretty cool, and it's pretty cool to also see all the other brothers and sisters that are coming out and do the same work. You know, like I'm just one of many. You know, there's so many, not only here in Michigan, but because of my work with CFSY, I'm able to like go out of state and also meet all the other brothers and sisters that are doing work, all over the place, and it's just very humbling.
So where are you